This is International Arrivals.
Welcome.
You have arrived at your destination.
I'm Emily Lutzker.
And I'm Anna Kamasia.
Today, International Arrivals speaks with David Khang, who's based in Vancouver. David's one of those rare people who's a dentist, a lawyer, and an artist.
Welcome, David, and thank you so much. We're really happy to have you here today to talk with us, and we're really excited to talk a little bit more about you and about your work.
So maybe tell us, how did you get to be an artist, a dentist, and a lawyer?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Emily and Anna, for this invitation. I always welcome engagement with interesting and exciting people in the art world. And that question, it's been such a long, meandering journey that I've learned how to distill it into a nutshell, and I'll unpack it after the aphoristic statement. Dentistry was an accident of and logic of immigrant experience. Art was a way to individuate and fulfill a sense of play, which didn't exist prior to, and going to law finally loops back into my family upbringing, where my childhood and teenage years were full of thinking through global conflict and conflict specifically in my motherland on the Korean Peninsula. And then, of course, that as I grew up, I began to connect the dots with other conflicts all throughout the globe, whether it's in Cyprus or in Palestine, Ukraine today, and in my own adopted nation state of Canada.
Yeah. So you were born in Seoul, is that right?
That's correct. I was born in Seoul, Korea, and then I remember, and so maybe I'm dating myself, but those were the days when there were still military dictatorships that are in power, presidents who came in who were 5-star generals who came into power through a military coup, and then they controlled the Korean people in the southern half of the peninsula. And I always make sure that I don't talk about North Korea and South Korea, but southern half and northern half of Korea. And my family were devoted to in a sense liberate itself from first the Japanese occupation in the first part of the 20th century, and then the American forces in the latter half, and perhaps ongoing today. Yeah.
Right. And so how old were you when you left Korea?
I was 10 years old. And then soon after we moved to Toronto, Canada, we got news from Korea that 2 of my uncles were arrested and imprisoned for their political activity. And they weren't, of course, they weren't the only ones. There were many throngs of nameless people who either were tortured or disappeared without being named. And later on, I would connect that to the desaparecidos in Argentina and Chile and everywhere else.
I was actually just going to ask you that because it is referenced in so many, particularly South American countries. Mm-hmm. Is there a name or a way of thinking about that time when they disappeared in Korea? I don't know. So I was just curious.
They don't talk about the disappear, but Korean people have collectively talked about Minjung, which is literally the people. And so the Minjung movement, and then it connects to, we may touch on it, my theological training. And the Minjung theology comes borrowed from the South American liberation theology, which in turn comes from the Ivrit or Hebrew tradition of Exodus. Now, the complication, if we may just go into the political realm of that, is that the Exodus language and idea and memes are all great as an idea, But then what it forgets to complicate that meme is who becomes displaced as a result of that liberation. And so
Right.
we can think about the Palestinian people, we can think about the indigenous people in North America and Latin America who are displaced from this colony. So.
Exactly. And I think that continues in so many places and continues to continue in the sense that it's happening as we speak. It's not just something in the past either.
Yeah.
I mean, the displaced often become the displacers.
And which is why I'm very critical of the cultural dominance of Korea today internationally, but very, very powerfully in East Asia. And much as the world is criticizing Qatar and for the migrant labor that was used to build all the stadiums in World Cup, like the immigrant laborers that come to Korea to continue to build Korea is just staggering, and the lack of rights that they have.
Mm-hmm. And is there a particular group that are laborers in Korea?
They're from all over Mongolia, Philippines, Thailand.
So like Qatar.
That's global movement, right?
Exactly.
Which ties in with something that will probably be mentioned in what I thought was a very important book for me was Mi Won Kwan's One Place After Another, Site Specificity, Specific Art and Locational Identity.
And about contestation in those spaces. Yeah. Like I just actually introduced her to my class, and we talked about this idea of a site being not only layered, but also having these conflicting ideas of what it means and how it means. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, just a segue there, going back a little bit, maybe to sort of conflicts in general and what's happening now in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I'll kind of bring it to your work, right away, thinking about the podcast, and I'm looking at your website, and I found the kind of your most recent project, or one of your most recent projects, which is called "Liar, Liar, Your Tanks Are on Fire," from 2022. I'll describe it probably, wrongly, so you'll have to correct me about it. But I'm looking at images from the war in Ukraine, and you've collaged on patterns of the monarch butterfly wings onto photographs of not just tanks, but also children and pieces of tanks that have been destroyed, objects of war, and also objects of protection and freedom. I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit. I was struck by the images, the timeliness of them.
I will more often than not resist talking about it, but I will talk about it. That kind of dissonance that we feel, especially from the safety of our first world context, where the wars are mediated to us, conflicts are mediated to us through, whatever, all like once removed at least, if not second or tertiary. That I am trying to create opportunities for audience engagement that is not mutually exclusive between this is a good statement and that is a bad statement, which is why I also avoid identification of as a political artist. So I often differentiate between political art, and Anna, you might have heard me say this before, the difference between political art and art that functions politically. Mm-hmm. And I think the times when art that does not look politically but functions politically are very, very effective. Mm-hmm. I think my work tends to look political, but in the best of times, I believe that they work politically. Of course, that needs to be unpacked rather than remaining as an aphoristic statement, a catch-all tune. So when I think about the juxtaposition, I want us to consider the beauty of the butterfly, but also the brutal grotesque of war and how they can commingle. I think Ocean Vuong does that beautifully in his writing. He writes about imagining butterflies that arise out of the flames of Vietnam. And so there was a resonant moment, and I think we texted each other a few times about how my visual work and his literary work kind of are doing some parallel things.
For me, when I look at that work, I think about precarity. That's the thing that strikes me, is just this space, people, countries, communities, etc., that are in a precarious place or a precarious moment, versus the butterfly, which I also see as something precarious. I don't necessarily think about like the beautiful. I think about this monarch butterfly that's endangered, that has to make these huge journeys. And so for me, it's about people being displaced because of war, and that link between bodies and butterflies.
Yes, and I think I agree with you, and I think there is a tendency to talk about precarity and resilience in the same breath. And I'm with you, Anna, that I prefer centering precarity, because to speak about resilience is too easy.
I think it's very easy, particularly, as you know, like having spent time in Palestine and working with Palestinians, and that's always, they're so resilient. And it's like, what does that actually mean? Because they're
doing nothing about the situation. People can take it.
But the monarch butterfly is something that you take throughout your work in various ways. Could you talk a little bit more about the butterfly itself, and why you've adopted monarch butterfly?
So, in going back a few years and thinking back to the bodies of work that I've worked on, as you may know, that one strand of work was the Lamont Young project, where I try to perform Lamont Young's compositions, 1960. And then the Wrong Places series that began as a separate body of work, that was with military signifiers that didn't involve the butterflies back then. So one of the 1960 compositions of Lamont Young was "Turn a Butterfly Loose in the Room," and then release them when the performance is over, which I performed very literally by getting monarch butterflies ordered and then releasing them in a performance space. It was in LA at Track 16, and that was the beginning. And then I slowly started developing different kinds of manifestations of the butterfly. One of which was at NYU at Performance Studies International, in 2007, I believe, and then at some point, as I was about to close up both bodies of work, as images pop up in our heads, this image of butting together those two motifs, and what would happen if those two things were butted. Then I just tried it. And I imagined rather than a military camouflage, what happens if a monarch butterfly camouflage was plastered all over military fatigue, on a tank, on rifles.
It's interesting that you use the word camouflage, though, because it's obviously not camouflage, because it's so bright and beautiful, So you think, what does it do then? It's actually not doing what it's supposed to do as camouflage. Yes,
the uncamouflage.
Yes,
bringing attention to noting out of place. As much as you've talked about the wrong place, it's also out of place.
Well, I totally agree with you, and the inversions keep happening like a teeter-totter, because it instantaneously for the audience, and it may happen for some audience, that the monarch butterfly pattern camouflages the militariness of it. So the two are going back and forth, on a different angle, one might recognize them, like prioritize the militariness as a central signifier, and then it keeps flipping, and that the flipping is what I find to be productive.
Yes, because there's that one image that you have of Tank Man during the Tiananmen Square, and you have the tanks covered in the butterfly motif. And for me, because that image is so embedded in my own brain, and I think it's such a hugely powerful image. And then when you do have the butterflies on the tanks, it does something else, and I'm not sure what it does, but it's like a push pull, as you say.
And that's the beautiful. Those are the beautiful moments that we look for in creative work, right? Like we don't really know what it's going to do.
Yes.
When we make the move, which is why I always encourage, now my former students, because I'm not teaching anymore, of always, rather than just talking about it, materialize it and see what it does. And so, a significant part of what I consider my practice is playing with materiality. And so representation is, or an illustration or representation is insufficient for soaking into a person's core, or the audience's core.
I think I wanted to talk a little bit about the tank work, because that's something that you have done for a long time now, and in different formats, right? There's the book that you generously gave me that I have right here, The Tank, the Poem, and the Uniform.
That was very fun to work on.
Yeah, and Wrong Places. Let's talk a little bit about that. Maybe you can explain for the listeners what that project is.
Sure. And Emily mentioned at the beginning of the current conflict in Ukraine.
Yes.
This past week, I heard on the radio, CBC radio, of a Ukrainian teenager who's living in Western Canada. I can't remember whether it was BC or Alberta, choosing to go back to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow!
That struck me. I identified with it immediately because when I was a teenager growing up in Toronto, suburbs of Toronto, I felt like I was in a wrong place. And because people who were 5, 10 years older than me were the ones who were being tortured and being disappearing. Again, I suppose if we were to psychologize it, it was a guilty feeling. But if, of course, the North American tendency would be to individuate and to remain almost formal at a psychological level, rather than considering the larger global social context. And then, maybe scrolling very quickly to grad school when at UC Irvine, when Yuan Kwan came to speak to us, and she had just published her book, One Place After Another, Site-Specific Art and Locational Identity. That was very helpful to have helpful mental and academic scaffolding,
right,
from which I could develop a body of work. What it helped me to distinguish, and she did that so well, is differentiate site responsive work versus deep research into a site. So that kind of site specificity the vocabulary was something that I gained from Miwan's writings. And then the invite to work in Nicosia, Cyprus, allowed me to kind of start researching from a blank slate, not knowing much about Cypriot history, but then research, unearthing in my own mind connectivities to the division between the northern and southern half of Korea, much like in the Cypriot island between Turkish and Greek forces. So and I asked myself, what would it mean to butt those things together in a logical narrative? And maybe compartmentalized, siloed narrative, it makes no sense to connect those narratives, historical narratives. And I would totally agree with that analysis. But at the same time, this is the liberty that's given to creatives, right? Of lateral thinking. What happens when you put those things together? And it does something that as we said earlier, and something that we can't predict until you try that out. So, using a military fatigue that was gifted to me, that was a original Korean military fatigue, and then going right to the border with the border guards watching me, reading a reunification poetry that my uncle, who had written it in prison in Korea, not to a largely Anglophone and Greek-speaking audience, but choosing to read it in Korean instead. And what kind of dissonance is produced as a result of that miscommunication or communication that is nonverbal?
Yes. I read in one of the essays that I read, they talked about slippages of meaning, mistranslations, and miscategorizations. And I thought those were nice terms in themselves, of thinking about particularly the way that you use language, where you speak in Korean to places that don't necessarily understand Korean.
Yeah. And the mis term is one of those things that we take lightly, and we think that it's wrong. But just again, this past week, Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Was interviewing Dr. Gabor Mate, who's from Vancouver, and they got on the topic of disillusionment from doing difficult work around poverty, right, in the city. And he just brushed it off and said, well, I mean, not brushing off Amy Goodman, but brushing off the idea of disillusionment, and said, well, what comes before disillusionment is a state of illusion.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which is something that I think one can argue that that's the fault of first world, that we're living in this illusion that somehow we can, stop the borders to prevent COVID from coming in, or migrants from coming in, or we live in a post-race society, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So being disillusioned is one step closer towards, in the Canadian context, it's like addressing truth first before moving on to reconciliation, right, with Indigenous peoples.
Right. So. Right. And often in the Canadian context, we talk about reconciliation, but the reconciliation, like meaning that there once was conciliation, there's also that right. that we have to contend with too.
There's no state of disillusionment that is necessary, a prerequisite towards reintegrating.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it's interesting to think about language and speech, though, because that was so integrated into like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that started in South Africa. Hearing people's testimonies was such an important part of healing.
Yes.
And so I think then, I wonder how language, I don't have my thoughts aren't clear, but I just think about the relationship with language and with hearing, right? Of acknowledging. Yeah. And so I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say there, but I'm just.
Well, and I would add to that is that I think I too would center that, Anna, and having been through this ringer called law school just recently, where what you're referring to isn't necessarily addressed in law school, in legal training. That the full emphasis is on turns of words, what they mean, how they're defined, and how they're construed. So it's not about facts and necessarily about facts, but how the facts are framed
or narrated. Yeah.
So,
and how do you unnarrate or misnarrate, or how do you find the slippages? I guess it's about slippage again, right? So that's kind of fascinating, thinking about your law degree of looking for those slippages, and then thinking about your artwork that's playing with those slippages, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm thinking through actively these days of how those slipped meanings and different kind of ways of looking at the world can connect temporally and temporarily to create something new that I don't know what it is yet.
And do you think that's a non-verbal connection then?
Not necessarily. I think it can be nonverbal, but it can also be verbal, just as much as work that aesthetically appears as political can also function politically.
Right.
So the external signifiers aren't as critical as the dynamics
Of the work in the world?
Yeah, and how they interact with the world, and which is why I think I think that was the determinative factor in exploring performance art, because of coming from a sculptural and installation background, and initially thinking that my body was yet another material to use, which is why materiality is very important to my work.
Right.
But then it's not a mere formal material like copper or marble, but it's also a racialized and gendered and classed body. So it's a perfect medium in which to introduce, interrogate.
Those categories, really.
Yeah, all of those things. Yeah.
And I think that it comes at a time too of like thinking about everything that happened, particularly in the US and perhaps in Vietnam, but I don't know enough about the history of people in the street, and realizing that people were in the street because of their race, because of their gender, because like, so you had the women's marches, you had the civil rights movement. So you had, all of a sudden you realized that the body was a political site in itself. And I think that that also, moves performance forward as well.
Which is why, like, I see in your space behind you, two boxing figures, and I think about Muhammad Ali.
It is Muhammad Ali, actually.
Oh, it is excellent. Yeah,
and Joe Fraser.
His position that he ain't gonna go to some other land for white people to kill yellow people as a black man. So.
Yes. I mean, I think Muhammad Ali is an incredible orator and figure and icon and all of those things, because of his realization of his racialized body and how it was being used.
Yeah.
What's next? What are you thinking about in terms of like having just written this law exam? Like, are you able to even jump back to the art world and think about how that might affect it? Or are you just sort of taking time now to think about law?
Finding what feels like, who am I who am I?
Yeah.
That age-old question. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was thinking I was imagining a party, David, that you would throw where you have this group of friends who are dentists, and then you have this group of friends who are lawyers, and then you have this group of friends, who are artists in the art world. And not having the dentist party, the artist party, and the lawyer party, but bringing them all together and seeing what happens, like where besides that all of the practices are in your head, can who would have the most interesting conversations when they mixed, and who would have the worst conversations, like who wouldn't connect,
Well, this is where I think the question of who am I is really critical, because I have tried those experiments, and it doesn't work well. They separate very quickly into oil and water.
Yeah.
I've met, really interesting and really boring, pedantic people in all of those categories of society. So for me, I think the important thing is like being nimble at putting on different hats, and I think we can all do that.
But I keep thinking we trying to fit these like as if they're Russian dolls, or cubes or whatever you want, where one thing fits inside the other. With the three things that we've been talking about, like law and art and dentistry, but actually maybe they don't ever.
Yeah. So this is the temptation of our rapid fire networking and relationships, mediated relationships, right? They become memes rather than unpacking them slowly. I always resist the desire to be read as, one colleague of mine, a young man in law school, said, "David, you know that guy in that Dos Equis beer commercial, the world's most interesting man? I think you're more interesting than that," which was which is a good compliment.
Very nice.
But we had a conversation which didn't go very far because he didn't get the part about dentistry being uh, an accidental logic of the immigrant experience.
Mm.
He didn't get that because he's been stable all his life.
Right.
Was he living in the place where he was from and a white man?
Yes.
Yeah.
The man, his father was a lawyer. He loved sailing. All those,
right.
All the things that he was supposed to do.
Yeah. So I resist the narrative of the Renaissance, and which implies some degree of privilege.
Absolutely.
And,
absolutely.
To do whatever you want. That isn't necessarily my story. My personal story is about a lot about struggle, and I think about trying to rise above the poverty line through a particular kind of professionalization, which I recognize that is not possible for so many migrants today.
Mm-hmm. Or for people who are living below the poverty line. It's just not possible.
And I'm, dealing with that population through law, try to at least mitigate harm, social and economic and physical harm for them. A really poignant moment when I was dealing with a family that was constantly under threat of eviction. And from what I could tell from their family name, they may have been Sudanese refugees. I don't know. I had such a hard time understanding what she was saying because clearly English wasn't her first language, and I couldn't get through the accent, and it was very frustrating because as a from legal advocacy perspective, I need to know what she's saying exactly.
Right.
What got me through that is when I identified with her through my dad and how difficult it must have been for him trying to feed the kids as an immigrant. So that kind of recognition is I find it to be like, those are moments when I can thank the people that came before me and people who and I make references to my uncle in my work heavily. And those are the formative, and that's what I mean by collective,
right,
across time and place. One thing that I have said to a group of young adults, in terms of, and these were kids from the Korean Canadian community with very conservative parents, upper middle class, wanting their kids to do the secure thing. We all know that narrative. And one of the questions that I posed to them that made them very deeply contemplate the question is, can you imagine a world without art? And so it asked in an inverted negative, as a negative question. and so that I think that broadens the lens from the individual. What am I supposed to do? And so when I asked the question earlier, who am I? I mean, of course, we recognize that that's not an individuated question, and it becomes individuated because we live in this paradigm called neoliberalism that is based on the individual as the sanctity of the individual, and I'm going to deliberately use the word his rights because his rights are seen as normative, and her rights or their rights are trampled upon, especially today.
Particularly in the United States.
Yeah. And more
recently. Exactly. What I mean is, yes, we have gone back with Roe versus Wade.
And I would say, speaking from my context, living on Canadian soil at the moment, or the soil of the Coast Salish people, to be more correct. When our Prime Minister stands up and says, "Well, we will welcome any women from the United States that wants to come up. We will open our arms to it." And so, that's the kind of illusion where it maintains the niceness of Canada, and it further limits us from going to search the histories of our own slavery and our own Africville that we demolished, and and the in Japanese internment, and all those histories that we don't really like to talk about.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where that's why one of the reasons why I'm interested in unearthing historical flashpoints and hotspots, and then bringing a site-specific art lens to it.
I like this idea of unearthing. I've been really interested recently in the ways in which artists unearth histories, both physically and in terms of historic analysis of what took place. Like I think it's important to do, and I really am drawn to work that starts to unpack, if you will, a site or a place or a people, and then we start to realize that there are so many layers to place, particularly, that have not been talked about enough. So yeah. I'm really drawn to this idea also. I think we've talked about this idea of trespassing and like what does that mean and in what ways, and then unearthing is also a nice word because it then becomes like about archaeology but also about revealing.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, like we're recognizing that artists can do this, but so can archaeologists, so can urban photographers, so can international human rights lawyers.
Well, I have one last question. Now, since you're in Vancouver, do you feel at home there?
In part, yes, and in part, no. I think I've heard some artists talk about feeling homeless, and I think it's less about place. And I want to emphasize that I've heard a number of people who moved to Canada recently, and then they complain about and rightfully so, I think, about the coldness of people sometimes, and maybe Canadians could see that as being proper or some kind of a social distancing. But I hesitate to ascribe it to a particular place, and I often suggest that perhaps that's more of a product and function of 21st century capitalism. So going back to your question of Emily of feeling home, I feel like I've engaged enough and lived significant portions of my life enough to feel that Vancouver is one home, Toronto is one home, and then whenever I go back to Seoul, Korea, it also feels very homey. But that is also significantly, I think, a function of our relationships, and the grounding and the emotional stability that we feel in those relationships.
I also think it's about nostalgia too, because I think that where the place that you often leave comes to represent so many things about a lost past, about who you were, about your generations before. And so I think that there's also that gets this sort of imagined past too.
Yeah, and the imagined past is something that I always push back against, right? The nostalgia, my favorite working definition of nostalgia is remembering things as they never were.
Exactly, mine too. I love that as well.
So yeah, it's a funny place. But there are many other funny places, odd places that make us feel both at once at home and not at home, right?
And it's almost as if I think from my personal experience that the more places you live, the harder it is to feel like one place is home too.
Sure.
That I think rooting becomes more difficult as you become more nomadic, perhaps.
Mm.
Thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us today and taking time out of your busy schedule. So thank you. And thank you for talking about your work and your ideas. Always interesting to talk to you, David. So thank you.
It was a pleasure.
If you want to visit David's work, you can visit www.davidkhang, DAVIDKHANG.com.
This is International Arrivals, supporting artists from countries in conflict.
You have arrived at your destination.
Bem-vindo ao Pinto Place.